Good evening, 49er faithful. Very excited for tonight's episode. We have a special guest. We are doing a Bengals special here on the Thursday night special edition. I hope you brought all of your questions that are Cincinnati Bengals related because we have our resident expert here. Very proud to introduce Taylor Cornell of the Bengals podcast entitled Who Dey Den. The Who Dey Den.
That's right.
That is a fantastic name. I love it. Taylor, why don't you tell them a little bit about the podcast and about how they can follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, I actually started the podcast back in, like March, April maybe, and it all stemmed from the social media arguments of Jamar Chase versus Penei Sewell. And I got tired of typing the same thing over and over. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast, get my thoughts out there. And didn't really know, how long it had gone. I'd done other podcasts for fantasy football and stuff before. And the off season was a little interesting to get through the dog days of the summer. But now that we've gotten into in-season content, it's been a lot of fun. So I'm usually putting out a couple episodes a week, previewing the upcoming opponent. Yours, just posted today. Thank you for joining me last night to talk the Niners. And then I'll do one probably like Sunday night, Monday morning, recapping the game. So it's been a lot of fun, just enjoying that ride and getting my Bengals thoughts out there.
I love it. I know I love talking 49ers and I can relate to getting that voice out there, being able to interact with the fan base. It looks like we have a bunch of the fellow sneakerheads in the chat right now getting excited about this 49ers Bengals content. I was thrilled to be on the podcast. I thought that was a great episode. Anybody listening should go and check that out and hear yours truly in there. What you're going to see tonight will be sort of a mirror image of what we did on the podcast. So if you think to yourself while you're hearing the content tonight, man, I'd really like to hear the flip side of this in the Bengals versus 49ers, head over, check out the podcast. It is definitely a good listen. All right, getting into our topics, both of these teams are dealing with injuries. It is a sad reality for the 49ers and has been so for quite some time. 49ers fans are absolutely beside themselves every time they have to put up with extensive injuries. This week is rough. We have a couple of guys that are still not practicing that are critical for the 49ers in Elijah Mitchell and Deebo Samuel. Elijah Mitchell with the concussion, Deebo with the groin injury. We'll be looking to the practice reports tomorrow to find that out. But on the other side, Taylor, how's the practice report looking for those Bengals injuries?
Yeah, I think things are maybe a little more promising than we thought they were even 24 hours ago. There's injuries to a bunch of big players on the Bengals side. Awuzie, who's our best defensive back, he was, I think, limited today on the rehab field. Didn't get any official practice, but They said he was dressed on the rehab field, so I think that's good news. It's better than it was yesterday when he didn't practice at all. Burrow was out there throwing. Looks like he's going to be good to go. Higgins was back out there again. Logan Wilson is the guy that's probably the biggest loss for us that we know for sure will be out this week. Injured his shoulder in the game last week. Ironically, on a special teams play on a punt return, our starting linebacker was out there on a punt return. And, there's been some mixed reports on whether it's a torn labrum, whether it was just a dislocation. Either way, he's not playing this week, and that's going to be major for the Bengals defense.
Was he the best middle linebacker out there?
Yeah, definitely. There's been some injuries at that position this year. We had another guy, Akeem Davis-Gaither, a little more raw maybe, but very athletic. So it was nice to have that athleticism out there. He got injured earlier in the year, out for the season. And Wilson was really coming to his own earlier in the season. 4 or 5 weeks into the season, he was leading the NFL in interceptions with 4, which is a little fluky for a linebacker. But the ball was finding him early on in the season. The turnovers have kind of slowed down for him a little bit as expected, but he's been our most solid guy up the middle. And now without him, they're going to be relying on a few more wild cards. Jermaine Pratt's one of them. I think we'll talk about him later. Joe Bachie's another one that is very unproven. So not really sure what to expect in the middle of the field from the Bengals this week.
Well, that's good with those depth issues there for the 49er faithful to dream about, because the middle of the field is certainly a topic we will hit on again, but a strength for the 49ers. Just touching briefly on Joe Burrow for a bit, it is his throwing hand where he injured the pinky. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So it's a dislocation of the pinky. He said during the game he tried against the Chargers. He tried was going to try a glove. In his press conference this week, he said he just couldn't get it to fit on there without it being painful. They taped it a little bit. He really just played through it. I'm guessing adrenaline plays into that a little bit. Me,
Right.
myself, my day job does not provide me the adrenaline to play through an injury like that. I'd probably have to stop typing at my computer with a dislocation. But hey, he
I think
fought through
so.
it. He fought through it. And it sounds like today even he was handing off with that right hand, whereas in the Chargers game he had started handing off with his other hand, trying to protect it as much as possible. So it looks like he's going to be good to go. He doesn't anticipate missing this week's game. I don't think anyone in Bengals land anticipates him missing anything here as well.
Well, that's good. That's good. I mean, I do want to face a team at least at reasonably full health so that it feels like a good, solid matchup. When did he actually injure the finger in the game against the Chargers? Was it early on or later in that game?
First drive of the game. First
Oh,
drive of
wow.
the game.
So he played the entirety of
yes.
that with the injury.
Yep. And I was at the game, so I wasn't getting the TV replays necessarily. But one of my friends who was there was getting some texts from some of his friends that were a little closer to the bench saying something's wrong with Burrow's hand. You know, Twitter entertains me enough there, provides enough info for me. And that's where we learned, like, okay, he's dislocated his pinky, and we didn't really know what that would look like for the rest of the game. I mean, the 300 yards he had against the Chargers wasn't flashy, but he still was making some really tough throws in that game. A couple, one to Boyd, one to Higgins is one that really stood out to Bengals fans this week. Impressive when you think that he did that on his throwing hand. You got to think the pinky is really impacting the grip he has on the ball. But he was able to get it where he needed to go. So seeing how he played last week, you don't think it would be impacting him negatively at all this week with a few extra days of rest in there.
No, I would think he'd be good to go. All right, let's shift the focus from the quarterback to the trenches. We have some interesting matchups that are happening here. So right now we are looking at the Bengals defensive line against the 49ers offensive line. So you have a couple of key matchups there. On the left side for the 49ers, it seems to be strength against strength. You obviously have Trent Williams for the 49ers at left tackle. I don't think I'm using any hyperbole when I say I believe he is the best left tackle in the league to this point in the season. I'm reasonably certain that PFF and other statistical measures would hold that up to be true. The eye test is there. He's dominating people in the run game and been very solid in pass protection with a few hiccups there, here and there, obviously. But for the Bengals on that right defensive end spot, you also have the stud they brought in from New Orleans, Trey Hendrickson. So it does seem like an iron sharpening iron type of situation. How do you see that matchup playing out with strength on strength for the Bengals?
I mean, I'll say I don't think Hendrickson has probably gone up because you mentioned Trent Williams being one of, if not the best, at least the way he's playing this year at left tackle. Hendrickson, I mean, he had 13 and a half sacks last year. He's already got 11 and a half this year, 8 straight games with at least 1 sack. He has gone up against the other top pass blockers, especially at left tackle. If you look at least from the PFF measures, like Colton Miller from the Las Vegas Raiders, who played them a few weeks ago, he's one of the better pass blockers in the league as well at the tackle position.
Right.
And he actually had one of his worst games of the season against Hendrickson. It wasn't anything where Hendrickson was wrecking the game plan for the Raiders necessarily, but Colton Miller that game still did give up 3 pressures, a sack. Hendrickson got in there as well. Last week against Rashawn Slater, who's a pretty good left tackle, albeit a rookie for the Chargers, gave up 3 pressures and a sack as well. So I don't think this is going to be the type of game where Hendrickson is consistently in the backfield necessarily wreaking havoc for Jimmy Garoppolo. But to say that I predict him getting shut out completely, it's hard to predict that when the guy's been so productive for pretty much every game of the season.
Yeah, that's just it. I was reading up on him, and that seems to be his mantra is 1 sack per game, that's what he's chasing, that it is consistency he's after. And I would expect that in that matchup, he will get the better of Trent Williams on occasion. I mean, that's what happens when a stud goes up against a stud. There's domination on both sides of it. I am hoping the edge there goes to Trent Williams for sure. But it does set up on the opposite side potentially the more interesting of the two matchups. If Trent Williams and Hendrickson are holding one another in check, and you assume it's a couple of pressures, potentially a sack for Hendrickson, The right side of the 49ers line is not so pretty. Where we have the best left tackle in the NFL, I think it is fair to say, and I'm not trying to disparage the individual, but as a swing tackle, as a backup tackle, Tom Compton just might be the worst right tackle in the league. And he's markedly better against the run. And he is still, 64 tackles in the NFL, right? That is the 64 best athletes in the world at that position. So even if you're 64th, you're still a stud. I'm not trying to disparage the man, and he's on my team. But I'm being realistic here. I tried to look up, who you had opposite, and it seemed that you do have what the 49ers have been missing, which is a bit of a bookend on that other side with Sam Hubbard. Can you tell us a little bit about how Sam's performing this year and what you expect him to be able to do on passing downs against Tom Compton?
Yeah, Sam Hubbard is one that he got paid before the season, and coming into the season, Bengals fans expected Hendrickson on one side, Hubbard on the other, tag teaming, going to be in the backfield consistently pass rushing, and it wasn't really that way earlier in the season. We talked about Hendrickson's been pretty consistent throughout the year. Sam Hubbard started off really slow. He's got 7.5 sacks on the year right now, but he only had 1.5 sacks in the first 6 games. He just wasn't really impacting the game very much. He's really picked it up as of late, 6 sacks in the 6 games since the start of the season. So he's been much more consistent. And if you look at as far as teammate duos that are at the top of the leaderboard in pressures, Hubbard and Hendrickson are up there together, which you can't say for a lot of teams. A lot of teams have one really good pass rusher, at least a guy like a Nick Bosa or, like a TJ Watt. There's at least one guy that a lot of teams have, but to have 2 guys that are towards the top of the leaderboard and pressures is pretty impressive. I think Hubbard's going to have a pretty good game. Like I said, if we'd have been playing this game 6 weeks ago, I would have had some question marks about whether Hubbard would have a great impact. But the way he's been playing lately has been pretty impressive. And I think, in one sense, Hendrickson helped open things up for Hubbard and vice versa with the way they kind of feed off of each other. And then we've got some good pass rushers in the middle too. BJ Hill, who we got in a trade for Billy Price, which was absolutely a fleecing of the Giants. I have no idea why they gave us anything for Billy Price, but we got BJ Hill, who's been in there rushing the passer a little bit. DJ Reader in the middle, Larry Ogunjobi. Like, we've got some guys on the interior that can get some push, and then Hubbard and Hendrickson have just kind of been back and forth all season long, working the edges. So I expect if everything you're telling me about this tackle, as great of a guy he may be, not performing as well, I think Hubbard could be in for one of his bigger games of the season, perhaps.
It strikes me that the 49ers will struggle to double team the edges because of the fact that you do have some good defensive tackles. I mean, certainly DJ Reader is capable of eating up some double teams himself. If you have those stout D tackles in the middle, it sets up a lot of one-on-one on the edge, with potentially the 49ers needing to keep George Kittle or Kyle Juszczyk in to chip on one of those edges, in particular on that right side. I do wonder if the 49ers will run to the left, where they have significantly more strength in Williams and Tomlinson on that left side, as opposed to going to the right. But sometimes Kyle Shanahan tends to use that weakness as a strength and sort of run towards it, because Tom Compton is significantly better against the run than against the pass. It'll be interesting to see how it sets up. I'm most nervous if the Bengals are able to jump out to an early lead, because that puts Tom Compton in a poor situation where you're in obvious passing downs, and that would be significant trouble for the 49ers. All right, looking at our next topic, which hopefully is an advantage for the 49ers, because I think that right tackle against left defensive end may be going to the Bengals on that one. But when we look at the Bengals' ability to muddle the middle, you touched on it earlier, that is where the Bengals have been vulnerable so far this year, that the middle of the field, the lack of depth at linebacker, the injury feeds into that. That is a strength for Jimmy Garoppolo. If you want to make Jimmy Garoppolo uncomfortable, you cover the middle of the field like nobody's business and force him to throw outside the numbers and take deep shots. Will the Bengals be able to take away the middle of the field, or is that a weakness for the defense?
Yeah, I'm really concerned about the middle of the field. I think with Logan Wilson out, there's question marks now. Jermaine Pratt has been coming on here in his third season, but he's still pretty inconsistent. Bengals fans are excited about what his future might be, his potential that he has there. But last week was his best game of the season by far. He played great against the Chargers. If you look at his other game logs, they're pretty hit or miss. And the games where he's had to as far as snap counts, he's been in coverage more often. Against the Jets, he had a pretty poor grade across the board. Against Baltimore in week 7, had a pretty poor grade across the board. So when he's been forced to be more of a coverage linebacker, it hasn't been pretty more often than not. So that has me a little concerned. If Debo plays, obviously, even if he doesn't, George Kittle in the middle of the field. I think for the Bengals, and maybe one of the coaches will listen to this and take my advice, but I think it's going to be actually perhaps Jesse Bates and Von Bell from the safety positions that play an important part in this game, kind of locking down that middle of the field. And Jesse Bates has been really bad in coverage so far this year. We keep waiting on that to turn around. But if those two guys can help provide some support in the middle of the field, I think that'll go a long way towards kind of masking some of these linebacker questions we have in Cincinnati.
Playing into a little bit of the depth at safety to make up for a lack of depth at linebackers. The 49ers were forced to do that more recently because of significant injuries to the linebacking core. We're still down Dre Greenlaw. Last week we were down Fred Warner, and we had to bring in some interesting formations in an attempt to make it seem like we had enough linebackers out there. But thankfully, we have enough safeties that are converted linebackers from college and vice versa, that it worked out quite well. Well, speaking of the secondary for the Bengals, that seems to be another area that the 49ers may look to take advantage. From my research, it looks like the Bengals secondary or pass protection, pass defense is ranked 27th in the league. Is that a result of the fact that you do have such a high-powered offense and you're putting up points, and therefore at the end of games, teams are trying to come back on you and getting garbage yards? Or do you see that as a weakness for the team at secondary?
I'll be honest, I was surprised when I saw 27th ranked pass defense, because overall our defense has been pretty solid as a unit. If you just, you can sort by a number of different things. If you just looked at scoring defense, we've been in the top 10 for the majority of the season. Last week, I believe we fell out. I think we're 12th now or something like that. But to see our pass defense that low is a little surprising to me. It doesn't feel that way. And I think really teams are not necessarily exploiting weaknesses in our pass defense more than they are avoiding our run defense, because our run defense has been really solid. So they've been throwing more against us. According to Pro Football Reference, the Bengals pass defense has the 6th most pass attempts against. So it kind of makes sense that we've given up more yards. We've been passed against more often. But if you look at the 300-yard passing days that this defense has given up, it was Kirk Cousins in week 1. It was Aaron Rodgers in overtime in week 5. And then the immortal Mike White from the Jets in week 8, which was an absolute joke of a game. But those are the 3 quarterbacks that have gone over 300 yards passing against us. So overall, the defense is kind of a bend, don't break type of mentality. So yeah, we'll give up 6, 7, 8-yard completions. The key is making the tackles short of the sticks. And they didn't do that in the Jets game. And that's why Mike White was able to rack up 400 yards, because of all of the missed tackles and yards after catch and all that. I really don't look at the pass defense and say that's a major weakness on this team. Obviously, if Awuzie doesn't play, it's weaker than it usually would be. But generally, I think teams have been avoiding running against us. I don't foresee the Niners avoiding the run, since that's such a big part of their identity. But we'll see.
Yeah, it will be completely dependent upon health for the 49ers. You have two of the four members of the running back crew who are on the 53 that are currently in concussion protocol. So there's a lack of depth there. Deebo Samuel is, in effect, a running back as well, and he's potentially out. If Deebo and Elijah Mitchell are out, you could see Kyle Shanahan trying to get creative. Jeff Wilson Jr. would be the next logical guy up at running back, but he's dealing with knee soreness after an MCL injury in the preseason that he's coming back from. Jermichael Hasty is really the only totally healthy back on the roster at this point in time. And for the 49ers, he's just been a third down type of back. He is not someone that they have counted on to be a bell cow by any stretch of the imagination. So to to the 49ers credit, it really is about injuries at that point, whether or not they have starters coming in. My hope is Elijah Mitchell does play. He's played through a lot of injuries to this point, but with a concussion, it will be all up to that concussion protocol. He came in Monday, reported a headache, and that put him into the protocol. So the optimism is that he'll be able to play. That would make a big difference. As far as health on the Bengals side, I know that you already mentioned the health of your starting cornerback. I read that Trey Waynes may be making a reemergence as well. Would that make any difference in the Bengals' ability to cover 49ers receivers?
In short, I'll say I don't know, because Bengals fans have not seen enough Trey Waynes over the last 2 seasons. He missed all of last year with a torn pec, his first year of his contract. And now in the second year of his contract, he's played, I believe, 1 or 2 games and been set back with some injuries as well. So we don't know what we're getting out of Trey Waynes. We don't know, even if Awuzie was healthy. The question was, is Waynes immediately supplanting Eli Apple opposite of Awuzie at cornerback? And we don't know the answer to that. Now, if Awuzie is out, it might not matter. We may need to push Waynes into a starting spot. The Bengals fans don't know what they're getting. A lot have turned sour on Waynes, and it's unfortunate because he's not trying to get injured, but in a 3-year deal that I think was $14 million a year for a cornerback, put him near the top of the market at the time he signed it. To have not gotten many snaps out of him, we don't really know what we're getting. I mean, I would say his return is good from a depth standpoint. In his career, he's been a pretty good run-stopping cornerback. Hopefully that still lives inside of him somewhere. And that's, 2018 and 2019. So we're 2 and 3 years removed from when we can say he was a really good run-stopping cornerback. Is he? I don't know. We've got some other depth guys we've signed in the last few weeks as well, but you don't want to really be relying on those guys. Trey Flowers, I believe, was cut, and we ended up signing him. Vernon Hargraves, we signed him as well. So we have some depth at the position. I don't know if I'm comfortable with that depth outside of Awuzie and even Eli Apple, who's played well recently.
Oh, I muted myself and then didn't unmute. 49er faithful can definitely relate to paying a lot of money to somebody and then not getting much out of him on the field. That is still the case with several members of the San Francisco 49ers. We definitely have some bad memories there. All right, before we get into our next topic, which is just that transition from the secondary to the run game, I am going to bring in, we got a super chat here from Leo coming in. Appreciate it, Leo. Just joining. Hey, Rob and Taylor. I can't shake this feeling. If Debo and Mitchell are out, Lance has to be at least strategically used or we lose. Leo, I have to agree with you wholeheartedly in that without Elijah Mitchell, without Debo Samuel, where are the 49ers going to get production in the run game? That is a nightmare scenario. You would think Jeff Wilson Jr. would be next man up, but it certainly appeared on the sideline against Seattle, and by the reports this week that he is dealing with that lingering knee issue. He hasn't had the same burst he had last year coming off of that injury. It's fair to wonder what he'd be able to contribute, and I'm just not very confident in JaMychal Hasty being able to contribute at a very big level like a bell cow running back. You've got to be able to generate some pressure on the defense. You've got to be able to put them into scenarios that flex them, that force them out of their comfort zone. What better way to do that than playing 11-on-11 football? Get Lance in there, allow him to take advantage of play action, roll out, not running him in the way that we did against Arizona where we got him injured, but definitely getting him out there. Taylor, how do you see it breaking out? Have the Bengals faced very many mobile quarterbacks so far this year?
Outside of Lamar Jackson, not too much. And Lamar Jackson, ironically, put up a pretty good final stat number in the game we played, 12 for 88 rushing. The Bengals, though, really schemed well against that to eliminate. There's a couple longer runs in there that skewed those numbers a bit. But the Bengals really were, you could tell defensively, like Hubbard did really well that game, getting upfield on his pass rush. And if he knew he wasn't going to get to Lamar, he was dropping back a little bit to contain Jackson from being able to just move up in the pocket and scramble for 20 yards. Outside of that, there haven't been a ton of quarterbacks we've faced. It would worry me if Trey Lance does become kind of a wild card in this picture, because I don't think that he's necessarily a piece that the Bengals are scheming for right now. So it would be interesting if he got some play. I'm not sure how much he's been getting lately there for San Francisco, but if he plays a part here, I don't think that would be something as a Bengals fan I'm very comfortable with him out there, because he's the type of athlete, obviously, that we know that can break off some chunk plays and make things happen with his legs too.
Yes, he can. Niner fans are clamoring for it, like Jamie Bryant here. It's Trey Lance time. Put the man out there and let's see what he can do. We also need secondary help desperately. 49er faithful are somewhat less faithful in Jimmy Garoppolo at this point in time. It is definitely, when you come off of a game like we did against Seattle, our nemesis, the people who have had one up on us for quite some time now, it is painful. And 49er fans want to attribute some of that pain to Jimmy Garoppolo, and after his performance, it's fitting. So we're hearing a lot more clamoring for Trey Lance, and I'd like to see him at least for a handful of snaps against Cincy, again, to flex that defense. All right, bringing in Chris Royal here. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome, Taylor. My question is, will your offensive line be able to handle the great Nick Bosa? He's averaging a sack a game as well. We covered this on the podcast, so you all should go check it out. But do you want to give them an abbreviated sneak peek of what we covered on the pod?
Absolutely. It's interesting. The offensive line struggled pretty bad last week. 6 sacks, I believe it was, maybe 5 allowed to the Chargers. But we were playing without 2 of our starters. Our center was out. Our right tackle was out. 2 guys that hadn't missed any snaps all season, really. So it was kind of expected having a couple backups in there. It looks like both Trey Hopkins at center and Riley Reif at right tackle are expected to play. Quentin Spain's been solid at left guard. Jonah Williams has been very solid at left tackle. Really, our question mark when all of our starters are out there has really only been at right guard. So if Nick Bosa is a guy that's going to be mainly on the edge, I don't have a whole lot of concern necessarily. I think like Max Crosby's probably the last good edge guy we faced, because Joey Bosa was injured last week early in the game, so we didn't get to see a lot of him.
Right.
Max Crosby was pretty neutralized. He was getting some pressures in there, but the Bengals do a good job, get the ball out quickly to try to get it out of Burrow's hands. I like our tackles. Again, I think it might be similar to what we were talking about to a lesser degree, because our tackles are not to the level of Trent Williams, but
Sure.
Where Hendrickson's probably going to get in there at some point and get some pressures and hopefully get a sack, I wouldn't be shocked to see Nick Bosa get a sack and a half, something like that. I don't necessarily, if our line's healthy, foresee him having like a 2, 3, 4 sack type of game. We've seen TJ Watt, I think, had a 3 sack game last week. So some of these guys like Nick Bosa can do that. I'm not sure I see that if our line is back at full health.
That's an important distinction. It will be interesting to see. They will occasionally slide Nick Bosa inside. They've been doing whatever they can to get him the best matchup. He is so versatile that he can go from one side to the other on the edges, and then at times they'll rotate him into that D-tackle spot. I'll now be interested to see if they put him over top of the right guard in an attempt to take advantage of the best matchup there. I would predict about the same, that Nick Bosa is pretty consistent in his ability to generate pressures and pretty consistent in averaging that 1 sack a game. That doesn't strike me as a very dominant game to go for, say, 3 pressures and a sack, but that feels about right for what Nick Bosa might be able to do against a good matchup for the Bengals, as long as they are healthy there as well. All right, let's get back to that stout run defense that the Bengals have. This one does, in fact, show the opposite of the stats on the passing game. And it was interesting. In the passing game, it was 27th ranked, but it was mainly yards. It wasn't scoring, and it wasn't, it was really just about teams being able to rack up the yards, so a bend but don't break type of a defense. How about with the run game? In my research, it's been an above average defense when it comes to stopping the run. The 49ers are obviously going to be focused on that, maybe to a lesser degree if the injuries take out a few key players. But again, in looking it up, in this one, it's a bit flipped. Top 5 in yards and rushing attempts. So they're not giving up very many rushes or many rushing yards per attempt, but a little closer to the middle of the pack, 10th in rushing touchdowns allowed, 11th in yards per attempt. So how do you see this defense being able to, let's say that the 49ers run game is at full strength. We have Elijah Mitchell and Deebo Samuel out there. How do you see it matching up for the Bengals?
Yeah, the run D has been pretty consistently strong for the most part. Probably helps that we've had continuity there along the defensive line as well. DJ Reader being one of the guys that occupies a lot of space, gets good penetration and makes tackles, doesn't miss a lot of tackles, which is obviously important in the run
That's
defense.
huge.
Yeah, early in the season, it felt like we got off to a little bit of a better start. We did a pretty good job bottling up Dalvin Cook. The next week, David Montgomery didn't have a great game against us. Najee Harris, we bottled him up in week 3. So we were kind of starting the season off feeling pretty good. It's a little hard to tell against some of these teams where it's like the Lions, like they don't really have a run game that you're worried about. The Raiders were struggling running the ball when we played them. So in the teams that you look at that have had pretty good running backs, we've done a good job. The area where I think, and this isn't necessarily run defense, but where running backs I've heard us have been catching the ball out of the backfield. The Bengals have struggled in that area, both in a coverage standpoint and a tackling standpoint. The Jets game was the biggest example of that, where he's Ty Johnson. Like, come on, he's Ty Johnson, and he's catching the ball out of the backfield a bunch of times and breaking all sorts of tackles. But we've seen it again and again. No matter who we've played, if they have a pass catcher out of the backfield, they give us trouble. And that could be another area where if you're lacking the Logan Wilson type of guy in the middle of the field, if Jermaine Pratt's not assigned to George Kittle or zone in the middle of the field and he's matched up against the running back, whoever it may be. I'm not sure if Mitchell's been used much in the passing game.
Limited amounts, but not a great deal.
Yeah, so that's what worries me more is when we go up against those like Ecklers of the world. They worry me a little more. I think Eckler would have had a better game last week if he hadn't fumbled it a couple of times too. So yeah, the run defense has been pretty good all season long. It's not one last year. This was a team that gave up 400 yards rushing in a game to the Ravens. So it's been a complete switch for the defense, and having Reader healthy, which he wasn't last year, has probably been the biggest difference for us.
Yeah, if you're able to clog the middle of the line, that is a huge, huge difference. Eating up those double teams, clogging lanes, having a big guy out there makes a big difference. I'll be interested as you break that down with trouble on halfback screens or any type of passes out of the backfield. I'll be interested to see if the 49ers use Kyle Juszczyk in that role. He is the better pass catcher out of the backfield for the 49ers, playing out of the fullback spot. And he has done some damage at points this year. 49er fans get upset with the inconsistency of his usage, that he'll go weeks without really touching the ball, but he is a fantastic pass catcher. And that will be something Kyle Shanahan might lean on. Chris Royal picking right up on that. Might be a good time to give Juice some significant movement. I would love to see that. I don't see many of the other running backs catching many passes. Perhaps JaMychal Hasty as our third down back. If he's used more, it might be beneficial for the 49ers to get him the ball in space. He's not a particularly big running back. If we flip the script, we are talking about a fairly big running back, but we're talking about a balanced Bengals attack. This reminds me very much, to a lesser degree, because the Cardinals are an air raid offense, but reminds me of the Cardinals matchup for the 49ers because it's a very balanced offense that the Bengals have. You have 3 elite pass catchers in Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, and you do have a true starting bell cow back in Joe Mixon. It strikes me as a balanced offense. Is that how you see it as someone who spends a great deal of time observing the Bengals? Is it lean one way or the other between rushing and passing?
Yeah, I think last year the Bengals got a little too far over their skis with Joe Burrow, and some of it was necessitated by Mixon was injured,
Right.
and we were losing by a lot in many games, so we were throwing a lot more. This year, I think they've tried to be more balanced, and they've done a pretty good job about it. Early in the season, play calling got a little bit predictable. We knew first down, the Bengals go under center, and they hand it off to Joe Mixon. Any other down, if they're in shotgun, it's pretty much passing, dead giveaway type of stuff, and that has really improved as the season gone along. And we saw there was a stretch there of games where Joe Mixon was getting a lot of work. Most recently, Week 11, Week 12, back-to-back weeks against the Raiders and Steelers, 30 carries and 28 carries. 280 some yards combined in those two games. Cooled off a little bit last week, 19 for 54. A lot of that was due to the offensive line issues because our center, who was starting in place of our usual starter, was getting pushed back a lot in run defense, and being down 24-0, that played into his involvement as well. But what the Bengals want to do is keep the game close enough. Don't put yourself in a 24-0 hole, 24-0 hole, so that you can be more balanced. And what that does is it helps slow down the pass rush a little bit, so you don't have to worry about Joe Burrow getting hit as much if your offensive line is having an off day. Keeps them honest. I would say, usually run sets up play action. I will say Joe Burrow does not enjoy play action. He's actually less efficient running play action than he is not. Some speculate it's that he doesn't like turning his back to the defense.
That makes sense.
He likes to run shotgun, likes to run empty, those types of things. So in theory, it sets up the play action, but that's not really how the Bengals use it. They use it to take pressure off their quarterback, take pressure off of their offensive line as pass blockers.
It strikes me that the Bengals are fairly similar to the 49ers in that respect, setting up off of the run and preferring to manage the clock in time of possession. The Bengals also lead in time of possession over their opponents. I think it was 31 and change, which is a decent advantage to have over the opposing offense. And that has to be done by managing the clock and running the ball effectively. When you look at, obviously, the Bengals being 7-5, unlike the Niners, who are 500, unfortunately, they've only lost 5 games. But in those games that they have lost, what is it, in your estimation, that opposing defenses have been able to do to take away from the Bengals offense?
It's funny because this feels like a homer answer, but when I search my heart of hearts, it's really not a homer answer. If you look at their losses, it's been a lot of self-inflicted wounds. There hasn't been something we've seen defenses do to say every time they do this, our offense struggles. A lot of times, like last week, we spotted the Chargers 24 points in the first 18-ish minutes of that game.
Oof.
The loss before that, we spotted
to come back from.
Exactly. The loss before that, we spotted Cleveland a 24-7 lead in the first half, courtesy of a pick six on the first drive, a fumble, a turnover on downs on 3 of our first drives. Slow starts have been pretty common ground for the Bengals. It's if the other team takes advantage of those slow starts and gets us into a hole. Now, the Bengals will climb back. I put out a tweet earlier this week about the different disadvantages the Bengals have had and climbed out of throughout the year. Sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. But like last week, 24-0, you scored 22 unanswered real quick. And the Bengals were actually driving, ready to take the lead before Joe Mixon fumbled the ball and the game completely flipped. But the Bengals have really struggled with either their drives bogging down because they get behind the chains, whether it's sacks, whether it's tackles for loss on running plays. They go 3 and out, they punt, or their drives ending in turnovers. Those have been the drives where we see they struggle to score. Other than that, last week, 7 drives ended in a 3 and out or a turnover. In the other 7 drives, they went touchdown, into the half, field goal, touchdown, punt, and turnover on down. So you're talking 4 scoring drives out of their other 7 drives where they weren't punting it on 3 and out or turning it over. You could say that about a lot of teams, right? Move the ball and you'll probably score. But with the Bengals, it is magnified that if they can get 1 or 2 first downs on a drive, it feels like they're going to score. If they go 3 and out, it's not unlike them to string together 3-4 straight 3 and out drives. And again, if that other offense takes advantage of it, it's not shocking to see the Bengals in a hole early on.
Well, unfortunately, the 49ers have struggled a little bit from that themselves. There have been slow starts for the 49ers. They have been mistake-prone themselves. It's funny to me that it does seem a little bit like the Spider-Man image where they're pointing at each other. There are a lot of commonalities between the San Francisco 49ers and the Bengals that start with close records, both sitting in the 7th seed right now, both in the driver's seat as far as making the playoffs going forward, but being inconsistent teams, having significant weapons on offense, but at times being unable to really take advantage of those weapons. The San Francisco 49ers certainly have had their fair share of injuries this year. I don't know how that relates on offense for the Bengals, but a lot of similarities between these two teams. Let's look at the quarterback position, the most important one on the field. For the 49ers, when we get into this with Jimmy Garoppolo, there's a reason that 49er fans are calling for Trey Lance. Jimmy was very solid up until the Seattle game. The past 4 or 5 weeks prior to that, he had some good games that he strung together. And then he came out in a very important divisional game against Seattle on the road and was unable to play a consistent 4 quarters. A lot of the bad Jimmy traits came back. Is that similar for Joe Burrows? Is he inconsistent, or are you seeing a pretty regular progression from him this season?
It's hard to compare this season for him to last season because the team feels so much different talent-wise, which is interesting because from an offensive perspective, we have a lot of the same weapons. But on the other hand, Jamar Chase wasn't here last year, and he's completely transformed our offense. Our offensive line is, even with its struggles this year, is way better than it was last season. And then, of course, the injury shortened his rookie year. So it's hard to compare this season to last season. But just over the last, 14 weeks or whatever, we have seen Joe Burrow improve in ways that you would maybe expect coming off of a major knee reconstruction. Early in the season, he had zero mobility. He had very little pocket awareness, didn't want to stand in and make throws, was taking a lot of hits. You could tell protecting that leg a little bit. And we've seen him become a little bit more mobile, not necessarily scrambling for 20 yards. Unfortunately, for Bengals fans, we have to worry when he scrambles, he does not slide very often. So he takes some nasty hits. Which every time he does, we're gasping and holding our breaths.
I bet.
But other than that, he's done a pretty good job progressing this year. I think Jamar Chase has really opened things up for him. We lacked a downfield playmaker last year for him. And a lot of people in the offseason pointed to his deep passing accuracy and how terrible it was. It's like worse than the league. But if you look at his seasons at LSU, it was like the best in the nation. So something gives. And wouldn't you know, you get a really elite downfield weapon in Jamar Chase, and turns out he is good throwing the ball down the field. So that's probably
back.
Exactly, miraculously. So that's been probably the area that you would circle and say he's gotten a lot better moving the ball down the field, pushing it down the field with accuracy and velocity.
That's so tough coming back from the injury. It did seem last season that the Bengals were out to get their first round pick killed. And it was sort of, from a national perspective, that's all you really heard about it. You didn't get to see on a regular basis what he was going through. But I can certainly relate, as can the 49er faithful, to a quarterback coming off of that leg injury. It took Jimmy Garoppolo a long time to be comfortable after he lost that 2018 season, blowing out his knee. There are people to this year that still believe he's in his head about that, and it has affected his pocket presence and his pocket awareness. I would think that a younger quarterback like Joe Burrow would bounce back from it a little bit quicker, just because when the gift of youth is the ability to sort of forget and put those things behind you. It's interesting to hear that he is already developing in that area this season. I don't like to hear that he's rounding into form, but I've got to agree with Javon here that says, I just love hearing both points of view going into the game. I like getting the information from the other side here. Steve-O Supremo has a question directly for you here before we get on to our next topic. So let me get that Joe Burrow's topic out of there. Steve-O Supremo says, Taylor, can you grade the O-line, D-line, and defensive backs of the Bengals? I'm a fan of Burrow. Other than that, I'm ignorant on the Cincinnati Bengals.
Yeah, that's a good question. O-line, I think when healthy, is what I would call an average unit, which for Bengals fans, we are celebrating and about to throw a parade that Burrow hasn't been getting killed as much this year because last year's line was so bad. So average
relative
looks great.
To the performance last year, it's night and day.
Average looks great. We still need, if we could shore that up this offseason with another big ticket guy there, maybe that would be nice. So they're about an average unit. Defensive line's been really impressive, and it's mainly Hendrickson and Hubbard, their consistency, and Reeder in the middle. They're definitely above average. It's hard to call them elite. Maybe Hendrickson, you would say, is an elite type of guy. I mean, 8 straight games with the sacks, pretty good. 24 sacks now in his last season, 2 seasons here. Defensive backs have been interesting. It's funny because from a Bengals perspective, we have Awuzie on one side who's been playing like a Pro Bowl cornerback, a top 10 guy at the position. He has been a very pleasant surprise, the free agent signing from Dallas. On the other side of him, with Waynes being injured, it's been Eli Apple. And man, Bengals fans were ready to kick him out of the city the first half of the season.
I bet.
I'm thankful that he most likely does not listen to my podcast because I never had anything good to say about him. And again, I'm sure he's a nice guy, but he was playing so poorly. And man, he has turned it on the last 3 weeks. So all of a sudden, Awuzie is injured now, and there's a little bit of question. But if Awuzie and Apple in their current state are out there, you feel pretty good about these defensive backs, at least at the cornerback position. Jesse Bates underachieving this year, unfortunate, but he's still a top safety in the league when he's playing up to his potential.
It does sound like the real advantage for the 49ers is trying to get into those scenarios where they take advantage of the yak brothers that exist on the 49ers, that getting the ball in space in the middle of the field and then allowing George Kittle, if he plays, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, to do their thing in space against what seems to be the weakness of the defense for the Bengals. Steve Osupremo expresses his gratitude for you answering his question. All right, let's get back to something that may give 49er fans nightmares. It certainly is what I'm focused on. Ja'Marr Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd. Oh my. Yes, that is a fearsome threesome when you have to account for Joe Mixon, right? This is not a team that you can completely sell out to try and take away the pass game. You still have to account for a running back that could potentially gouge you up the middle while still staying in primarily, I would guess, for the San Francisco 49ers defense, a too high safety look. Break down a little bit for 49er fans who may not be as familiar with each of those receivers. What do you see as their individual strengths, and which one do you think has the greatest potential for a big game for the Bengals?
Yeah, I'm pretty much over on the season on predicting big games. So on my podcast, I was doing a fantasy football section at the end where I'd say, okay, these are my fantasy breakouts of the week. And I continually picked the wrong wide receiver for us. So I almost stopped trying to guess. But Tyler Boyd is Mr. Consistent. He started off the season very slow and kind of expected when you've got Ja'Marr Chase, who is a real alpha. Higgins, I think, is an alpha as well on most teams. And Boyd is a chain mover, pretty much. And he's operating receiver. Exactly. He's operating out of the slot. He is pretty much uncoverable by linebackers, and you don't see him on linebackers a ton. Jacksonville, for whatever reason, maybe it's because they're Jacksonville, in that primetime game, they tried to put linebackers on him, and it was Boyd's best game of the year by far. So he's going to operate in the middle of the field. He's a pretty reliable guy as far as where he's going to be on his routes. Not very flashy. Last week had a pretty good game, and he's more your like 5 for 50, 5 catches, 50-yard type of guy.
Right.
Third down, he is the Burrow's favorite target on third down. Again, moving the chains. T. Higgins is one that has really come on, and there were huge expectations for him after his rookie season, where he played, kind of that COVID shortened off season. He's got a rookie quarterback. Then his rookie quarterback goes down, and T. Higgins continued to perform even with our backup quarterback in there. So big things expected for Higgins. Then we draft Chase, and it's like, okay, how are these guys going to coexist? And Higgins struggled early on. Some of that was injury. He was dealing with an injury earlier in the year, missed a couple games. I think even when he played in some of those earlier games, it was nagging. He looks healthy, and his last 2 games, he's been targeted 22 times, 15 catches, 250 yards. So he has been getting back to where he usually was. And that is doesn't create a ton of separation, but is really good at high pointing the ball, really good in those jump ball situations, making those 50-50 balls more like 60-40 or 75-25 balls. Early in the season, he was not coming down with any of those. Earlier in the season, he was not fighting through contact very well. We've now seen him kind of getting back to the T. Higgins of old and being used in that area. And then there's Ja'Marr Chase, who it's hard to find a weakness other than holding onto the ball sometimes. Last week's interception was one of the worst I have ever seen from a receiver, popping the ball up into the air. Could have had a 60-yard touchdown. It turns into an interception. Other than that, the guy separates. The guy beats one-on-one coverage consistently, beats press coverage consistently, and isn't just a burner down the field like a Deshaun Jackson. Deshaun Jackson in his prime he's burning down the field. Ja'Marr Chase really works all levels and works all levels, maybe I hesitate to say elite, but almost at an elite level already.
Right.
As a
You got to do it for
22-year-old.
some period of time before
Right.
it becomes elite. But he shocked me in that regard.
Yeah.
I thought he was just going to be the burner. I thought he was just going to be someone that was a speed guy that ran the deep routes. He's a true number one receiver by all respects in everything that I have seen so far this year. It sounds a bit to me like the 49ers may match up reasonably well against Boyd. I would expect to see K'Wan Williams, who's a very solid slot corner, primarily matched up there against someone who's more of a possession receiver. Higgins and Jamar Chase against our outside cornerbacks is something that I think 49er fans are going to have nightmares about, because you're looking at Josh Norman on one side and a journeyman who has been on and off the 49ers more times than you can count in Dante Johnson, most likely starting on the other side. There's an off chance that you finally see Ambry Thomas, the rookie we drafted out of Michigan, who was off because of COVID last year, came in, needed to hit the weight room to get to the NFL level. And it took him a while to get up to speed. He just contributed on special teams last week against Seattle. Maybe the only 49er who had a solid game on special teams. Special teams was atrocious against Seattle last week. And Kyle Shanahan talked him up, letting us know in the pressers this week that he had risen to the level of pushing the starters to actually get in there. We have been clamoring. The 49er fans have not seen much of their first-round pick in Trey Lance, our second-round pick, who was a right guard, and Aaron Banks, who cannot supplant our existing right guard to get rid of that right tackle that I was telling you about that's not so great. We want to bump Brunskill over to right tackle, get Aaron Banks in, but we can't seem to. And then the third-round pick was Ambry Thomas, as well as Trey Sermon, right? So we have all these picks that just are not contributing this year, and it is extremely frustrating. But it will be the matchup on the edges for those two elite wide receivers that I think will be the key to the game. And it will come down, in my mind, it will come down to the 49ers defensive line against that offensive line, as we touched on your podcast. That will be the deciding factor as to whether you guys light us up in the pass game or it stays a relatively close game. Speaking of getting lit up, how do you see this game breaking out? Will the Bengals pursue a balanced attack against the 49ers? Will it be something where they're attempting to hold the ball, control the time of possession, take strategic shots, and not take a lot of risks? Or do you anticipate a high-flying offense up against the 49ers?
I mean, I think they want to run the ball. They don't want to necessarily have Burrow throw it 50 times, especially if we don't have to, if you're playing with a lead of any sort. Again, the key is going to be not getting down double-digit scores early on where you're kind of forced into a scheme and play calling that you may not want to go to that early. I think there's some questions about Joe Mixon right now. He hasn't practiced this week with a mysterious illness, apparently not COVID related. There's not any concern yet that he's not playing, but there's also, from what I've seen, not a lot of news on it. But even if he does play, I do feel like this is a Joe Burrow week. And I feel like if his pinky didn't have some question marks around how it could impact him, I would feel extremely confident that he would have a huge game. Because of those points you mentioned, some teams have tried to shade a safety over to take away Jamar Chase. And we've seen T. Higgins now with like 250 receiving yards the last 2 weeks. There's somebody on the opposite side of the field that is directly benefiting from any of the coverage that Jamar Chase is taking. So defenses have to pick their poison. If you don't even have one elite cornerback or one elite safety, I don't know how Jamar Chase and or T. Higgins are going to be slowed down. So it feels like a game where Joe Burrow can kind of get back on track. He did have 300 yards last week, but the weeks prior, he was in under 200 yards passing as we went really run heavy. I think this is a 300-plus yard week for Joe Burrow, and hopefully you get out to a big enough lead with Joe Burrow. Joe Mixon gets to have a good game too. So we'll see.
Right. That's right. You get those default carries. I will say the 49ers do thankfully have one strong member in that secondary that I would put at the elite level, although he doesn't get the recognition on the national stage, and that's in safety Jimmy Ward. The reason he doesn't get the acclaim is because he just doesn't generate turnovers. That's not really what he's asked to do within the scheme. but he can eliminate. He is a wonderful man-to-man coverage guy. I could see them using him in creative ways. It'll be interesting with the thin depth at cornerback if the 49ers attempt to get some interesting defensive schemes in order to cover these elite wide receivers. It will take all of D'Amico Ryan's, our defensive coordinator's, efforts in order to truly hold that Bengals offense below a 30-plus point game. I think it's reasonable to expect that Joe Burrow will have a 300-plus yard game. It's just a question of what the 49ers are able to do on the other side of the ball, whether they'll be able to put up significant points as well. All right, before we get into the final prediction on scores here, just going to bring in a quick comment question here from Playboy Chewy coming in. How much do you think Lance can change the result of this game? Well, for me, this gets back to the 49ers potentially needing to play catch up with the Bengals. If, as Taylor just went through, they are able to put up significant passing yards, and that opens up the run game. And you see Joe Mixon getting 20, 25 carries on top of Joe Burrow putting up 300 yards. You could see that resulting in the Bengals scoring 28, 35. Can the 49ers get creative on offense to generate enough without some of the keys that might be missing in Deebo Samuel and Elijah Mitchell? We covered it briefly already, but I do think that bringing in Trey Lance and stressing the defense in that way, in particular, a defense that, as we have covered, it's clear that the linebacking core is where you want to attack them. If you're able to man up along the offensive line and keep that D-line in check, and Trey Lance can get outside, which you know he has the speed to do, you could see some larger gains, and that would really open things up for the 49ers to then be able to capitalize with Jimmy Garoppolo and his strengths as well. All right, let's get back into the final game prediction. Taylor, how do you see this one breaking out? I'm assuming that you probably are going to pick the Bengals on this one.
Yeah, I am. Now, it's not a game that I feel like I would be shocked if we lost, because I think, to some of the things we've talked about, there are ways where the Niners match up well. If the Bengals start off slow, which they have, and San Francisco hangs 13 on us early on, 14, and we get into a hole, that changes the game. So there are paths for this to be a 49ers win. I feel like the Bengals have too much offensive firepower. We're 4-1 in games where we score 30 plus. I believe the Niners are 1-6, 1-5 when they score less than 30, something like that. So I think this is one of those games where our defense will be able to do enough, especially with question marks right now around Mitchell, around Deebo. I guess if they both play, this could be a shootout, but I'm going to go Bengals, I think 31-20.
Well, you're not alone. You got a Bengals fan coming in.
There we go.
Who Dey? Yes, I am optimistic that the 49ers will get back at least one of Elijah or Deebo. If they get back both, I will be significantly more confident. But I do think this one sets up to favor the 49ers. I think they'll be able to get after Joe Burrow. I anticipate they will be able to generate pressure, make him uncomfortable, and force some of those turnovers that they will need in order to win this game. I'm slightly more optimistic. The 49ers have suffered from slow starts themselves this year, and that is worrisome for a team that, if they start slow, and the Bengals, as the 49ers, you really want to jump all over that. The late start, because of the fact that this became a desirable game to watch, definitely helps the 49ers, because that East Coast early start is never good for a fast start from a West Coast team. The San Francisco 49ers, aside from the games where they stay out east in between back-to-back road games, have struggled with slow starts. So I'm hoping that 3-hour difference makes all the world's difference for the 49ers. I have them getting after Burrow. I have them holding the Bengals below 30. So hopefully my prediction can come true. I've got the 49ers winning it 31-24. Thankfully, I've got fellow faithful also picking the Niners. Harold coming in, 49ers 24, Bengals 21 in a lower scoring affair. I'm hoping for a good game with a fun to watch, close shootout, some offense from both teams, and hoping it is sort of close towards the end. Although I'd be okay with a 49ers win and a blowout as well. But Taylor, thank you so much for joining us here today. This has been a fantastic episode. Again, if you have not gone and listened to the podcast, if you did not see me post that or retweet that on Twitter, please go follow Taylor. His link in Twitter is down below. You can see his Twitter handle right over there. You can go follow him and find that Bengals podcast, the Who Dey Den. Taylor, thank you so much for joining me today.
I appreciate it, Rob, and I appreciate 49ers Nation active in the comments there. Had a lot of fun interacting with you guys. I appreciate having me on.
Yes, indeed. All right, 49er faithful, I will be back tomorrow. I do not have the usual show with Grant Cohn. That is being pushed to Saturday morning at 10 a.m. I will have a live show Saturday immediately following that one, but look for a notification of a solo show coming out tomorrow at noon. So I will be back at 12 p.m. tomorrow. Until then, cheers, 49er faithful.